Who doesn't like great debate clips, especially from debates between Christians like Dr. David Wood and atheists like Tom Jump, or he might be agnostic, I'm not sure. But here they're debating the better foundation for ethics, God, and secularism on the Modern Day Debate channel. And this happens to be a pretty recent video. So let's catch a little portion of it, and then we'll chat about whether or not David and Tom had good arguments, or whether David had a good argument here. So let's listen in.
There are different preferences. Now, if you, as an atheist, want to treat your personal preferences as your personal preferences and your personal feelings as your personal feelings, I would have seen absolutely no problem with that. But that's just not what many atheists do. They spend their time, complaining about God, complaining about religion, complaining about Christianity, complaining about Islam, Christians, Muslims, the Bible, the Quran. Moral judgments are flying all over the place. And it really sounds like they believe in objective moral values, objective moral obligations, and so on. And this is when my inconsistency detector starts going off. Just to be clear, I'm not talking about all atheists here, I'm talking about some particularly vocal atheists, atheists who are more aggressive in their beliefs. They've got a disturbingly inconsistent methodology. When the topic is the existence of God, they seem to set their skepticism levels to maximum, so high that nothing could ever count as evidence for the existence of God. What do I mean here? Well, Michael Shermer once presented what he called Shermer's last law. His claim was that sufficiently advanced aliens would be indistinguishable from God. But that would mean that God would be indistinguishable from sufficiently advanced aliens. So I asked him, well, what could count as evidence for the existence of God that you couldn't just attribute to powerful aliens? And he made a joke out of it at first. He said, well, if God put a bunch of money in my bank account or something like that. But after the joke, he couldn't point to anything that God could conceivably do that would count as evidence for the existence of God. Richard Dawkins was asked, what evidence, if God did exist, what evidence could God give that would convince you that he existed? Dawkins couldn't come up with anything. He said that even if God wrote a message out to him in the stars, so that he could just attribute it to powerful aliens who are trying to trick him. Peter Atkins agreed that if God wrote a message in the stars, he wouldn't consider it evidence for God. He went on to say that if he died and woke up in the afterlife, confronted by St. Peter at the pearly gates, he still would not believe. Mike Licona asked Matt Dillahunty what would count as evidence of the supernatural. And Mike said, look, if you saw me beheaded, and I were beheaded in public, and everyone saw me beheaded, and then you look at the decapitated body, and I'm obviously dead, and later on I come walking in, and I talk about my journey to heaven, and I tell you about this person I met that you once knew who had a private discussion with you but then died, and then I'm telling you what that private discussion was because I met this person in the afterlife. Would that convince you that something supernatural has occurred? Matt said no. Tom here was once asked something along the lines of, if a Christian was standing in front of you, in front of an ocean, and said, in the name of Jesus be parted, and the ocean was parted, would that convince you that God exists? Tom said no. So what we find is that the people who are running around saying there's no evidence that God exists are the people who set up a methodology that's impervious to evidence for something that they don't want to believe. Now, I'm willing to lay this down as a rule. We could call this Wood's last law. Here's Wood's last law. If you're going to reject the evidence, no matter what it is, then you rejecting an argument tells us nothing about whether the argument is good or bad. Why? Well, if the argument is bad, you're going to reject the argument. But even if the argument is great, you're still going to reject the argument. So you rejecting the argument tells us nothing about the argument. So when you reject the moral argument, or the cosmological argument, or the argument from fine-tuning, or the argument from biological complexity, or the argument from consciousness, or the argument from reason, or the argument from logic, or mathematics, or the scientific revolution, or any of these things, that tells us nothing about whether these arguments are good or bad. Your methodology doesn't tell us anything about the arguments. Your methodology tells us something about you. Your methodology tells us even more about you when after instantly rejecting dozens of arguments for the existence of God, you turn around and start appealing to objective moral values and objective moral obligations. Atheists somehow have access to moral values and moral obligations that are so universal they would even apply to God if he existed. So that's why they'll say, well, if God existed, he would do this. If God existed, he would do that. They're claiming, one, that there are objective moral values and obligations, and two, that they know what they are. So where do they get this amazing moral knowledge that would apply even to God? If you're an atheist and you're being realistic, there's only a couple places you go for the origin of these moral values. You can say that we're just hardwired to believe in moral facts because it helped our ancestors survive and reproduce. Or you could say that society has conditioned us to believe in moral facts. But if those are your only real sources for our moral experience, there are no moral facts here. Being hardwired for certain behaviors has nothing to do with moral facts, and societies obviously can't be the source of moral facts because societies are often moral failures. So the point here is this: what happened to your skepticism? When someone says, I feel the presence of God, you say that's no evidence whatsoever. But when someone says, I feel that's wrong, that's the example he used. That's somehow evidence of this moral realm. Very interesting. Now, Tom cites a study on philosophers' belief in objective morality. This is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. So it said something like 70% of philosophers believe in objective moral values. That's interesting because that would show a kind of downward trend, because historically belief in objective moral values would have been significantly higher than that. But so you've got this 70% of philosophers believing in something, and that's supposed to be some basis right now for us and the way we think. Be serious now. If a new study comes out 5 years from now and says 70% of philosophers now believe in the existence of God, how much evidence will that be for anything we're supposed to believe? Zero.
See how that works? A little bit of an inconsistency, like he pointed out. And so I think David Wood did a rock star job here. But I wanted to just point out something about our objective moral values and duties. People would say, what are our objective moral values and duties? And a lot of times it fits under a simple phrase of to do what's right. And then it says, well, what is doing what's right? Well, we're obligated. We have moral obligations, and our conscience guides us to do what's right, to act in a fair means, to act in a just way, to be kind to our neighbors, to try to avoid harm to others, to try to be a good person, to go the extra mile. There's all kinds of things that we're guided by. The bottom line is it all sinks down to follow the golden rule, to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which Jesus so brilliantly pointed out in a positive way. He said that rather than the negative rephrasing. He put it out in a positive way a couple thousand years ago. And so let's continue to find an excellent debate. This was a wonderful one, but we're going to get a little bit of variety here. So stay tuned. Don't drop it yet. Surprise, here's another debate between holy Kool-Aid and inspiring philosophy. And this debate is on, is Christianity dangerous? So the approach is Christianity the religion dangerous? And of course, it doesn't ask whether or not Christians are dangerous. This is a different question if Christians do the bad things, because through history, certainly we have bad apples in the bunch. And so we've also found bad apples in lots of different bunches. We found really rotten atheists sometimes in the bunch, like, for example, Stalin or Mao Zedong, or of course, Pol Pot. But I digress. The point is, can you point out if Christianity is dangerous? So we'll start out listening to the back end of Thomas Westbrook, who's holy Kool-Aid's take. He is an atheist.
The documentary called Marjo. It won an Academy Award back in the 70s, where a young pastor, evangelical pastor, went around using faith healing methods, various tricks, and would get massive audiences to come and collect, pass the offering plate around, collect massive amounts of money, and then book it to the next town. People think that they're healed, they throw away their medication, and then they go and die of cancer. It's problems like this, it's verses like these that I've shown you that set people up to become made marks, to become gullible to this type of a situation. Many of these tricks were exposed by the mentalist and magician Darren Brown as well in his documentary Miracles for Sale. He would show how sometimes faith healers would find someone who wasn't completely crippled, and yet they were sitting, they might have crutches, and they come up and say, oh, here's a wheelchair, it'll be easier for you. They push them up to the front, and then the pastor would heal or pray over them. They'd stand up. Obviously, they could somewhat walk because they had crutches, but all of a sudden the congregation sees them getting out of a wheelchair. It's a miracle. Case after case after case, there's hundreds of different tricks that they use. It's all been exposed. Another situation, faith healing parents. You have the Scheibels. They believed in faith healing and that they didn't need to go to the doctor for modern medicine. Instead, they opted for faith healing. Their first child died of pneumonia. Very curable, very treatable, simply needed some antibiotics. Instead, they opted for faith healing. The judge gave them a warning for neglect, child abuse and neglect. The parents, instead of taking it seriously, when their second kid got sick of pneumonia, again, they turned to prayer and anointing with oil, faith healing methods, and their second child died. It's tragic, it's sad, but it happens.
So let me just start by reminding people what the topic is today. The topic is not, are Christians dangerous? Anyone can point to examples of Christians doing bad things or dumb things, but that doesn't mean Christianity is necessarily the cause of negative behavior. The Bible says all humans are sinful, depraved, and this is the reason we need Christianity. Okay? The topic is Christianity dangerous? And mere correlations and anecdotal evidence is hardly evidence that Christianity is the cause of bad or stupid behavior. Okay? I can find numerous examples, like the League of Militant Atheists, or atheists in general doing bad things. But it'd be absurd for me to argue like Dinesh D'Souza that this means atheism is the cause. Okay? This is actually called an attribution error. Okay? In psychology, this is when you unjustifiably attribute an effect to someone because of the beliefs or personality traits they have. But do not do the same when someone in your group does something bad. This would be like saying, look, I saw a priest do something bad, it must be because of his religion. But if a secular humanist did the same thing, well, there's circumstantial stuff there. You can't blame secular humanism because secular humanism doesn't advocate for such behavior. Okay? Basically, it's when you claim your actions, the actions of the members of your own group are situational, but the actions of members of other groups are related to their beliefs. Okay? To show Christianity is dangerous or causes harm, you have to need to find a place in the Bible where you think there's a negative quality taught, then show this verse actually means how you interpret it. Most Christians agree this is how to properly interpret that, and then show evidence this belief results in horrible effects in society and individuals. For example, some atheists will say that Matthew 10:34, where Jesus says, I came to bring not peace but a sword, means Jesus is promoting violence. They need to show that is the proper interpretation. Most Christians agree with this interpretation, and empirical evidence that shows violence is related to Christians acting out from this command. Problem is, these are all leaps in logic, and you need more than just non sequiturs. You need actual evidence of connections. Generally, what many atheists like Phil Zuckerman or Gregory Paul do is they look at ecological correlations, but not at individual correlations. And this can result in an ecological fallacy, which David A. Freeman says. This is where you think relationships observed for groups necessarily hold for individuals. If countries with more fat in the diet have higher rates of breast cancer, then women who eat more fatty foods must be more likely to get breast cancer. These differences may be correct, but are only weakly supported by the aggregate data. It is all too easy to draw incorrect conclusions from aggregate data. Let me give two examples. This study found there was more tolerance for Muslims in secular countries. But when individuals were looked at within these countries, researchers were surprised to find, and I quote, the strongest anti-Muslim attitudes are nonetheless found among the non-religious in these countries. The ecological and the individual correlation did not line up. Additionally, Christians tend to be in more conservative areas, which have less environmentally friendly regulations and laws. However, when individuals were looked at, researchers concluded we can assert there is no evidence that any of our measures of religiosity intensify the negative political conservatism effect. We provide evidence that the strongest negative conservative effects are found among those who are the least religious. So when you look at individuals, we can see that there is pro-environmental attitudes associated with religion, despite what the ecological correlation shows. Now, if Christianity is dangerous, a good way to show that would be to look at war and violence. So does Christianity lead to war and conflict? Well, there was one study that looked at interstate armed conflict initiation and if it's associated with Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism. The conclusion was interstate armed conflict initiation is found to be negatively associated with Christianity, mildly positively associated with Islam, and not associated with Buddhism. So if anyone's debating Muslims, come see me. So As you can see, Christianity was negatively related to interstate conflict. Another study found religiosity was negatively associated with a willingness to fight in territorial disputes. Another study, or moving on, if you go through the Encyclopedia of Wars, you can see very few wars have religion as the primary motivator. And when you subtract Islam, you can see the percentages cut in half. Now, we can also say there was an exorbitant amount of data that shows Christian religiosity is inversely related to crime and violence. This is a 2001 meta-analysis. It found crime was inversely related to religion. Now, also to note, a meta-analysis is not just one study. It takes data from multiple studies, combines them into the meta-analysis to try to find a general trend across multiple studies. Similarly, a 2010 systematic review looked at 270 studies and found that in 90%, crime is inversely related to religion. Only 2 studies, found religion was positively associated with crime. That's important. I'll come back to that later. A 2014 study looked at over 180 young adults and adolescents and found that religiosity was inversely related to crime, like drug selling and theft. A 2014 meta-analysis looked at over 190,000 young adults and adolescents, over 62 studies, and found that religiosity was inversely related to crime.
There are a number of meta-analytic studies that do point out this kind of thing. So I do want to point out something that is very specific to the meta-analysis. And what that is the fact that when you do a meta-analysis, you are supposed to collect data not only from published studies, but from unpublished studies. And you do that because published studies have a publication bias, meaning a lot of times you do not get published unless you have significant results, significant relationships between variables. And so if you don't have those significant relationships, you won't get published. So what people do if you're conducting this type of study is they'll contact authors who tend to focus on the particular topics in which you're interested, and they will ask them if they have any unpublished studies or studies in the works. And so they can get the data from those studies as well to include in the meta-analytic techniques, because they want to make sure they have the least biased results as possible. So let's keep going.
Things like theft, robbery, assault, and murder. Additionally, religiosity seems to correspond with lower levels of direct aggression and direct and indirect aggression. Intrinsic religiosity facilitates an increase in self-control. Greater religiosity was associated with higher levels of compassion and self-control. But this is just religiosity in general, right? Anything about Christianity here? Well, when you study the sample sizes in these studies, you'll find they predominantly draw from Christian sample sizes in Western nations. As one study put it, a large portion of the existing research has largely focused on Western nations. And a study that wanted to do specifically on Buddhists had to note, they said, as a mainstream religion in Western society, Christianity is typically the religion that is the focus for this type of research.
I can point out just like he's saying, most of the studies do come out of the West, especially coming out of the United States. There's a lot of studies and journals that come out of the United States. Most studies are published in English because of the English-speaking world where they're consumed. And the other issue, just to point out, that's pretty important here is the idea that Christianity, that is something that people have understudied. There has not been enough study into the other religions of the world and either the other people of the world. So they call us, we're in the WEIRD group. They call it, this is an acronym, WEIRD, the Western Educated Industrialized, and I'm forgetting what the last two are, but that is one of the things that we do. So let's keep going.
Now, how do we know the benefits of Christianity come from the religious beliefs and not just external factors associated with religion, like social structures and forming communities? When I debated Matt Dillahunty, this was his argument. Well, luckily, a large portion of the research divides subjects between two orientations, which can shed some light on this subject. The first is extrinsic religiosity. Now, extrinsic religiosity is these individuals are religious as a means to an end. They're not motivated by religion. One is religious not because they believe the core tenets of the faith, but because they want to be part of a community, gain social status, or because it's a family tradition. The extrinsic type turns to God, but without turning away from the self. Some qualify as intrinsically religious. These individuals find that their religion is their primary motivator. If one is intrinsically religious, they are religious because they want to hold to the core tenets of a faith. Having embraced the creed, the individual endeavors to internalize and follow it fully. So, if the anti-theist is correct, and the benefits Christianity provide come from creating social structures, communities, or extrinsic factors associated with religion, then more benefits should be associated with the E scale. But if intrinsic religiosity is associated with more benefits, then the benefits of Christian religiosity should come from if they're more associated with intrinsic, then the benefits more likely come from the tenets and beliefs of the worldview. So in a nutshell, to know if Christianity is dangerous, it's better to look at the effects of intrinsic religiosity. But when we look at the data, there's more benefits associated with the I scale, intrinsic. So a meta-analysis found intrinsic religiosity tends to correlate with desirable variables like mental health, altruism, and religious commitment. One looked at 34 studies and found aspects of intrinsic religiosity were associated with better mental health. Meta-analysis found religiosity correlates with agreeableness, extroversion, conscientiousness. And when you looked at people, those were identified as mature in religion, they aligned with 4 of the big 5 personalities.
I'm just going to highlight those personality factors really quickly. So this is, excuse me, this is the 5-factor model of personality, which originated with a couple of authors called Costa and McCrae. And you can see right there the initials. If you look at the way the acronym usually is, it's OCEAN. So you have openness to experience, neuroticism, and the opposite of neuroticism is emotional stability. So you want to have high levels of emotional stability and low levels of neuroticism. Neuroticism is related to worrying. And then we have conscientiousness. Conscientiousness has to do with achievement striving, working hard, really caring about doing a good job. In fact, conscientiousness is the highest correlate of job performance of these 5. The next highest is the inverse of neuroticism. So you want both conscientiousness and high levels of emotional stability. Agreeableness, the opposite of that is skepticism, and agreeableness tends to be something that you can see right here. It looks as if there are the higher levels of agreeableness. And then extroversion. So I'll just let him continue. So extroversion is the idea of being social, and people who are extroverts, that actually of the 5 correlates the highest with leadership. And these are the last things that I mentioned are part of meta-analytic studies. So here we go.
Traits and negatively correlated with neuroticism.
And that's a good thing. You don't want to be highly correlated with neuroticism.
Another meta-analysis found there was positive benefits from intrinsic religiosity and on extrinsic or ritualistic aspects of Christianity. Now, similarly, moving on, a review found that religious motivators intrinsic is associated with higher self-control and self-regulation. And the researchers noted they predominantly drew from Christian backgrounds. Another found intrinsic religiosity was negatively associated with depression. When it comes to suicide, the study author says it appears that commitments to the beliefs and rituals of Christianity is more of a protective factor for suicidal behavior than the indirect benefits, such as the social relationships that might develop from regular church attendance. Additionally, a meta-analysis did something, this is a little bit different. It drew on Christian sample size to look and noted that Christian priming, religious priming, was associated with pro-social behavior. This is when individuals are primed with religious study, prayer, and then study next to a control group. It was found that priming with religious motivators resulted in more pro-social behavior. So, moving past this to religiosity in general, one surveyed 850 studies and found religious involvement is generally associated with greater well-being, less depression, anxiety, greater social support, and less substance abuse.
So I would say that if the question is asked, is Christianity dangerous? The answer clearly is no, not as dangerous as some other belief systems. So I want to thank you for your time. Please like, subscribe, and do come again. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. I have posted in the description the full videos for both of these. So go watch them. They're on the modern day debate, rather recent debates, and enjoy yourself. Have a great night or day or wherever this finds you. Bye-bye.